The content of this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. Always consult with a qualified healthcare professional for any health concerns. Take care of yourself out there. Welcome to Unravelling, a podcast that sees the world through the lens of mental health. I'm Kurt White, a social worker and psychotherapist.
And I'm Mary Wilson, a journalist. Hi, Kurt.
Hey, Mary.
Well, guess what? It is Pride Month. And here at Unravelling, we have a tradition. This is our third year so far of highlighting topics that are important in the LGBTQ plus community. And this month, we're going to be diving into what you may know as conversion therapy.
Yeah, this has been in the news a lot lately, hasn't it? There's a Supreme Court ruling related to this that struck down some bans on the practice for minors. There's such a ban in Vermont, actually, where we are. And this has largely been a discredited practice that is sometimes illegal and largely spoken against by, professional organizations, at least with respect to how it exists in the field of psychotherapy.
Sort of confusing because it's called conversion therapy, but that's why we're going to be calling it conversion practices, because it indeed is not a therapy and instead is very harmful.
Yeah, and that is true whether or not it is done within the context of psychotherapy or some other kind of context, as I think we're going to see over the next 3 episodes, where we talk to really some very interesting, different folks looking at this through the kind of macro lens, we would say, in social work. How do these things affect large economic factors, the life course of folks with LGBTQIA plus identities of it?
Yeah, we want to start by really putting a face to these conversion practices. And so that's why we are interviewing Dr. Lucas Wilson, who has a personal experience with conversion therapy, actually sought it out, which we learned is quite common because of these sort of broader societal impacts. And he also collected other stories, wide-ranging stories of conversion practices, put them all together in a book to really humanize this issue and show everyone just how harmful it is.
It's a really wonderful collection of different short, creative nonfiction essays about folks that have encountered these kinds of practices. And I'm so happy that you were able to interview him directly.
Dr. Lucas Wilson is a public-facing interdisciplinary scholar of history, religion, gender, and sexuality at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, with multiple publications, including the one we mentioned, which is titled Shame, Sex, Attraction: Survivors' Stories of Conversion Therapy.
Well, let's take a listen.
Well, Dr. Lucas Wilson, thank you so much for joining us on Unravelling.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. Well, I had the privilege of reading Shame, Sex, Attraction, which you are the editor of and also contributed your own essay as well. And wow, there was some really heartbreaking stories, some really traumatic experiences with conversion practices. Even someone undergoing an exorcism was particularly memorable. As someone with lived experience yourself of conversion practices, was there a moment when collecting these stories that it really felt close to home?
Yeah, I think going into it, I had this idea of what conversion therapy was, and it was largely based on my own personal experience, as well as, a few filmic and literary representations, specifically, Boy Erased by Garrett Conley, and then the film, which was based upon the memoir. And so doing this collection really exposed me to the breadth of conversion practices. That it's not just within high control Christian contexts. There are, other places and spaces where conversion therapy happens. That it's not just with a pastor. It's not just with, an unlicensed professional. It's with licensed professionals. It's with, doctors. It's with parents. It's with oneself can be, one can be one's own conversion therapist. The collection has a number of stories coming from a high control Christian context, from evangelical, white Christian fundamentalist and Pentecostal spaces. And so reading those stories, it was like holding up a mirror to myself in many ways. All of the stories are different, but they certainly rhyme. One story in particular is a story that's set in Australia. The author was writing about his experience in a traveling band, and that he had these flashbacks essentially to his time in conversion therapy. And so I remember reading his story where he was talking about the anxiety of showering. And for most people, showering is, well, hopefully a daily thing, but, something that people do quite regularly and don't even think about, such a normal sort of mundane practice. Well, when I was in the church and when I was in conversion therapy, this was a site of anxiety for me, showering, because it was always this, sort of trepidation that I was going to be tempted to sin sexually. Reading that story revivified these memories, revivified these anxieties that I had about things like showering, things that were so, again, quotidian and mundane.
Can you talk a bit about what led you into conversion practices?
Yeah, it was something that I chose for myself when I was in high school. Not a decision today that I would make again. I think that ship has sailed. But for me, I come from a family where my dad was agnostic and my mom was, I always say, haunted by her Baptist demons that she grew up with. And so, of course, there was this, haunting in the house. And I certainly did see and hear things that were clearly a function of my mom's religious upbringing, with her parents. But for us, we went to church up until about grade 2 or 3 for me. And I'm the youngest of 5 siblings. All of my siblings had much more exposure to church and Sunday school and this kind of stuff, whereas I didn't. My mom had told us, how to say our prayers at night, how to say grace before meals. But otherwise, there really wasn't anything that was religious in nature in our home. If anything, after we came home from church, it was kind of like you'd go to Sunday school, you'd go to church, and then you'd shut the heck up about Jesus when you got home. You just didn't talk about it. And so I think for me, once I got into high school, that was actually when I converted. I became a religious zealot, I suppose, a young, excited evangelical. And it was largely through the creation versus evolution debate, blah, blah, blah details. Well, once I was in the church and, I was active in my youth group and, going to services on Sunday morning, Sunday night, volunteering, going to Christian camps, all this kind of stuff. I, of course, was thinking about and in a lot of ways obsessed about my sexuality because it was made into this problem. It was something that was to be cured, to be fixed. And so I tried my best to hide it. I don't think I did a great job. I watched a lot of HGTV. I think that I thought that going to church and becoming a Christian really was going to be a cover for me, that no one would be able to tell my sexuality because if I was a Christian, well, I couldn't be queer, at least in the evangelical imagination that was pervasive at the time and still pervasive today. But as I was progressing through high school, of course, it was time to think about which university I wanted to go to. And by the end, the decision was between 2 schools. University of Toronto, which is, arguably one of Canada's best schools, and Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia. And I made the unfortunate decision to attend Liberty. And what really motivated that decision was that I knew Liberty had a conversion therapy program. And I didn't call it conversion therapy at the time. I didn't conceptualize it as conversion therapy. And a lot of folks who undergo conversion practices don't think of their experience as conversion therapy. However, I knew that they had on campus a paid university employee who worked with 2 groups of students. The first group, those who were quote unquote addicted to porn. The other group, homosexually, those who were addicted to homosexuality, not an addiction. But this is, again, really the way it was framed for me. And so I knew that they had this guy on campus. I knew that he worked with folks like me. And so I said at the end of the day, if I'm going to make my decision, I think that this is really the place for me, because if I want to remain within the fold, if I want to remain an evangelical, I either have to become celibate, and that doesn't sound like the most exciting, prospect, or become straight, find attraction to women, and then marry a woman, and then I'll go and live my life of godly normalcy. It didn't work out that way. I'm still a big old homosexual today. However, this was how it was set up for me. This is how I understood it at the time, and how I was led to believe that I had to, again, pursue something like conversion therapy if I were to remain a religiously committed person.
Wow. And I understand this institution would penalize people for showing same-sex attraction. It was a very strict campus, right?
Still is, yeah. The school was started by Jerry Falwell. And if anyone knows who Jerry Falwell is, he was the one who started the moral majority. There's a direct line between him and Reagan, him and eventually Trump. His son was the first evangelical to endorse Trump publicly. There are so many connections between, the alt-right in the US and Jerry Falwell in this school. And so, at the school, there was a very strict honor code, a lot of rules. You couldn't wear certain clothes. You couldn't wear certain clothes in certain spaces. You couldn't dance. You couldn't hug for more than 3 seconds. You couldn't kiss, of course, if you weren't able to hug. And there were, internet blockers for a lot of websites. And most certainly, you could not be a practicing, quote unquote, homosexual. And this was, again, if you were caught in any, sexual relationship between you and anyone, but especially if you were queer, there were consequences for it. And so I lived in what we called the Liberty bubble. I mean, most university campuses have a bubble of some sort, but, Liberty's was perhaps, a sacred canopy as a way of describing it, this space that was very much separate from the world. I mean, I lived in Lynchburg, Virginia, where the campus was, but was I all that involved with many things in Lynchburg? Not really. We were heavily monitored. We had RAs who, were the heads of our different dorm halls, and they could write us up for any infraction of the honor code. And, they were watching us constantly, and they would warn us and they would threaten us with punishments and this kind of stuff. And so I knew that I couldn't be, a quote unquote practicing queer while there, lest I, faced the consequences that the school had very clearly laid out for us.
Mm. It's so striking that you and other people there, you met many like-minded people. You were there to, quote, heal yourself. And the people conducting these conversion practices genuinely thought they were doing the right thing, often to the point the people undergoing it of wanting to die by suicide. But how do you sort of reckon with people that are wanting to undergo these practices with the fact that we know now it is so harmful?
Yeah, people who really do, and I think a lot of conversion practitioners really do think it is the right thing to do, and that they're helping people, that they're pushing them in the right direction. And I do think that my conversion therapist, to this day, I think that he thinks that he has done the Lord's work. I think that he thinks that he did what was right. And so I look back at him, honestly, not with a lot of anger per se. I'm angry at the years I lost. I'm angry at the consequences of conversion therapy. But do I think he was motivated by hate and spite? In a certain sense, yes, right? Like homophobia and transphobia are definitional forms of hatred. But do I think that he was doing anything other than what he thought was, God's will and, again, what was right? No, I think that he really did believe this. And I don't hold a grudge against him, I would say. But I think that a lot of people do for their conversion therapists. And a lot of people from Liberty have a lot of hatred for, Dane Emmerich, who was our conversion therapist.
The community that you found there in college, there were other people like you who were desperately trying to change themselves. Walk me through sort of that process and the camaraderie you found with each other.
Yeah. The first person I came out to was at Liberty, and he was a friend of a gal I was half-heartedly trying to pursue. I was like, I need to find a girlfriend. And so he was her best friend, and we became just pals, and we started hanging out. And I remember he came to my work. I worked at the university switchboard. So anytime you called Liberty, you'd get me if you press 0. And so I was allowed to have friends over to my work. And so it was in the north part of campus, the secluded part of campus that no one really, trafficked all that much, especially late at night when I was working. And so he would come and we would do our homework together, and we would just chit chat and hang out. And one night he came, this was in about October, and we were talking about how there had been a problem between me and one of my spiritual life directors. Well, the problem was that I had hooked up with my spiritual life director, and he stonewalled me. He would not talk to me after that. He was, completely ashamed of what we had done. And so I was, left to think through and to sort of, figure out how to proceed, living in a dorm with someone who, again, for all intents and purposes, thought I was, treating me like I was just like dead. And this was my first, ever sort of like romantic encounter. And so I was like, often sort of my own emotions every single night, just constantly upset, not knowing what to do. And so I, like many angsty teens before me, had responded by writing a poem. I wrote a poem, and it was called, "You ever notice how cold it gets in the fall?" Looking back, like just terrible, eh? But I had written this poem, and I told him, because I said, yeah, something had happened, and I'm really upset. And he said, well, what happened? I said, I can't really tell you. I said, however, I can read you a poem that I had written. And he was like, okay. So I read him the poem. And I look at him and he's like, I think I know what the poem's about. And I was like, oh shoot, like my cover's blown. And I was like, okay. What do you think the poem's about? And he's like, but I don't really want to guess and be wrong. I said, why would that matter? And he said, because if I'm wrong, then you're going to know that I also struggle with the same thing. And the moment he said struggle, I was like, oh, I'm in good gay company. So, within a few minutes, we sort of fumble back and forth, and he tells me that, I struggle with same-sex attraction. Oh, I struggle with same-sex attraction, which is the phrasing in evangelical for I'm gay. And he and I would go on these walks, and we would talk just for hours and hours about, what had happened with my spiritual life director, what we were going to do in regards to us being queer, how we, what God thinks, what other people think. And, it was, so having him was in many ways a lifeline. But I did not want to burden him exclusively with this, knowledge and my emotions and me being sad boy all the time. So that's when I eventually went into conversion therapy. And that's when I decided to meet with my conversion therapist. In Shame-Sex Attraction, the book, that came out last year, I write about my experience in group conversion therapy. And I went to that group with another friend who, I'd also shared that I was queer with him, and he, shared with me that he was, but we were both, interested in, and again, really trying to become straight. But at the same time, we were like, well, also, we want to know who the other gays are on campus. And so we did, and we found this group. And then, as the story details, I met this other guy on campus who had been one of my campus crushes. I had seen him around campus, and we, had made eyes all the time, but I never really knew if he was queer or not. And of course, seeing him at the group cleared things up for me that, he was of the persuasion too. And so he and I, again, also formed this bond, this friendship. But I think, part of your question too was what brings people into choosing conversion therapy, right? And like what motivates us. I think in a lot of ways, we're pushed to choose conversion therapy. We're made to want conversion therapy. I mean, what does it mean to say that you want to erase a constitutive part of who you are? No one wakes up in the morning without, the influence of others to say, I absolutely hate this part of myself that, again, is as natural as a hair color. You're made to want to change. You're made to hate that part of yourself through the eyes of others. And so, conversion therapy is definitional abuse, according to all research. According to the UN Rapporteur on Torture, certain instances, not all, but certain instances of conversion therapy constitute torture. So what does it mean I consent to abuse? What does it mean I consent to torture? What does it mean I want to be abused? What does it mean I want to be tortured, right? These things don't make sense. And so whenever I think about the idea of, agency and choice and what pushes people into this, it's not ourselves. We're not choosing this. We're pushed to choose this because the idea is if you don't change this part of yourself and you don't accept, a life of celibacy, the other option is living that big old gay lifestyle that we're warned about and then therefore going to hell. And of course, when hell is your motivating, motivation for anything, that's, it's like having a gun held to your head. And so, of course, so many folks who are in high control Christian spaces are going to choose what they're told they have to do because the alternative is eternal damnation. That's what I think about when I think about conversion therapy and what motivated us to go into it. Looking back, I mean, it was such a sad group of guys. I even write about this in the story. It really was like wildly depressing to go into that room. I was like, I don't belong here. Like, it was just this anti-community. It was a community that self-cannibalized, that worked against its own, vitality and livelihood. The thing that brought us together was the thing we were trying to erase.
Wow. You mentioned these mental gymnastics, and it's just the toll that it must have taken to constantly be trying to change and hide who you are, while at the same time maybe acting on sexual desires and then feeling the shame and the guilt. I mean, what did this do to you?
Yeah. So for me, I always think about the violence of conversion therapy for myself being taking place after I went through conversion therapy, not so much in the moment. Because when I went through conversion therapy at Liberty for the 4 years I was there, I was always encouraged by my conversion therapist. His name was Dane Emmerich, a pastor who, again, was on staff at Liberty through the campus pastor's office. He would always encourage me in a sense, right? Where he was saying, you're doing the right thing. You're going in the right direction. Keep it up. This is what God wants for your life. And so when you have that sort of cheerleader, coach, mentor pushing you and encouraging you, it's not as bad in the moment, or it doesn't feel as bad. And the way that he oftentimes framed it was that he said, guilt is good, shame is bad, even though it was clearly like a lot of shame involved, and we could talk more about that after. But he would always separate. He would say, it's not that you as a person are bad per se, even though evangelicals do believe that people are bad as people per se. He would say that for that individual action, so if, I looked at a guy lustfully, or if I was tempted to look at porn, whatever, the temptation or the action was, he'd say, you are guilty for that individual action, but it doesn't reflect you as a person. He would always say that we weren't gay. We were just struggling with same-sex attraction. So we were heterosexuals, latent heterosexuals who just had this, pesky issue of, homosexuality that would plague us, clearly. But again, he separated that out from us. He said that you as an individual, you as a person, you're a child of God. You're, an image bearer. You are not a gay or a queer man. You're a straight man who's just struggling with this, sin. And so because of that, it was very much, okay, so if I'm just struggling with this and I did that one bad thing, but it doesn't necessarily reflect me as a person, then you felt in a lot of ways encouraged and good. And you're like, okay, I can keep doing this. I can keep doing this. Well, the moment I left Liberty and I went to grad school, I went to an actual university afterwards. And I was there and I started to quickly realize nothing had changed. And this was after, again, 4 years of meeting with Dane. This was after, if you added up the weeks that I fasted, it would have been a cumulative of months that I just over, span of 4 years, just didn't eat because I wanted to, again, essentially like beg God and get God's attention to change me. Prayer, asking people to pray for me. When I did eventually start coming out to more people and saying, I struggle with same-sex attraction, can you pray for me? And having this coercive prayer. I went through an exorcism myself once at Liberty. There was all of this. And I thought to myself, like, and I remember one night I was about to go to the pub to visit a buddy on campus. And I was praying. I was saying to God, I was like, God, what the hell? Like, I have tried and I have tried and I have tried, done all these things, met with Dane, again, prayed, read my Bible, whatever. Like, take your pick on any spiritual exercise. And certainly I had done it. I said, nothing's changed. What is going on? And so for me, when I realized that it wasn't just that I was doing this one action here or one action here that, I was quote unquote guilty for, it was that I realized that I as a person really was gay. And when you understand yourself as gay, within the evangelical imagination, emphasis on imagination, that is a bad thing. And that's a negative, pejorative descriptor. And so it wasn't just that I had done something bad here and there. It was that I as a person was bad. And so that negative energy wasn't directed towards that discrete action there or over there. It was directed inwards at the self, at me. There was a shift from guilt to shame, and that shame turned into self-hatred and metastasized, right? And just really created this beast, this monster of how I understood myself and how I thought of myself in relationship to God and relationship to other people. And then by the end of that, I started to reconsider my relationship to faith, my relationship to sexuality, to gender, all these things. The aftermath was, once I left that space, how that work that was done by Dane Emmerich shaped my self-perception and how I related to myself, again, for a good year and a bit, if not longer. And of course, I think it did take longer if you think about, again, the fact that I was in therapy afterwards, the fact that I was still writing and thinking about this kind of stuff years after. And so, maybe it's a lifelong process of, unlearning a lot of this and healing. I'm not, clueless. And I do know that, again, these things run deep and that the wounds are deep. And so for me, I would say that was really the violence of conversion therapy for me and the consequences thereof.
In the years afterward, and it sounds like it got really dark for you. Was there a breaking point when you were able to start to reconsider some of these things that had been drilled into you?
I remember I went to New Mexico for a conference. This was my first academic conference. I thought it was so cool. The university was paying for it. I thought I was, really making my way in the world. So I go down to New Mexico. And I had looked up, gay bars. And so I went to a gay bar, and I remember I was standing in line, and there was this group of guys ahead of me, and they were chit-chatting, and I heard someone say something about a cover for the bar. So I said to the guy ahead of me, I was like, yo, how much is cover here? And they're like, $20. And I was like, what? I was like, I can have like 2 beers after this. What in the world? Or like 3 beers. And so I was like, gosh, darn it. And he was like, why? Where are you from? And I said, well, I'm not from here. And he goes, well, where are you from? I said, Toronto. And he's like, oh, Canadian. And I was like, yeah. So we start talking. They bring me into the group. We're chit-chatting. Anywho, the point of this story is that I remember being in a group of gay guys for the first time and being like, what is this? Like, this is not what I had been sold up until this point, that it was, a bunch of, depraved, crazy, unhealthy, sexually sort of like charged, whatever. It was not aligning with the image that I had been given up until that point. And I was like, gosh, I would love to have a friend group like this. This would be so neat. So I went back to Canada, and I only had straight friends. And so I remember just being like, I need to figure this out. Like, I can't continue living this really, dark sort of day to day. And it was, in a very literal and figurative sense, like Ontario in the winter is a dark, dark time. And so, it does weigh on you. And so I remember thinking like, I need to figure out my relationship between my faith and my sexuality. And so that's when I applied to divinity school. That was really the place where I began to reconcile the relationship between, again, my faith and my sexuality. And it was a time when I went down and I said, I'm going to let myself live first and theorize later. Because up until that point, I'd always put my theology, which at the end of the day is just theory, first. And that framed how I acted in almost every way. And so I said, I'm going to live first and theorize later. And that for me was this massive shift, because up until that point, and I think anyone who comes from this high control Christian world knows that is this like, tectonic shift. Whereas for people outside of that, world, probably think like, what is the big difference? For us, when we were, again, in the church, it was everything. Your theology, your theory was everything. And so I shifted that. I switched the order, and I said, I'm just going to live as a gay person first and then see what God thinks afterwards. And so I did. And that's really, in large part how I started to extricate myself from the system, was realizing my lived reality, my day-to-day does not align with this theory. I can't do this anymore. It's clearly leading me to a very dark place. And if I continue down this road, who knows where I'm going to end up? And so I decided that I needed to, again, separate myself from this religious system, because, again, it was doing absolutely nothing for me other than harming me in really significant and deep ways.
Yeah. And you mentioned the lasting impacts. So what kind of supports did you find for yourself in getting out of that life?
I always say academia saved my life, because if it weren't for academia, I think that I wouldn't have had that concentrated time and space to think and to feel. I think that the beautiful thing about Div School was that it was both academic and also confessional. And so it allowed me in a very concentrated space to work through and come to terms with what it was to be an evangelical and again, to go through conversion therapy as an evangelical. And I think about that phrase, to come to terms, like to find terms, to find language, to articulate yourself. And there's one German theologian, Dorothy Sohle, she says that it's a radical act just to name what is. And that for me has stuck with me, right? Because like just to, for the first time, say, I'm gay. For the first time to say, I went through conversion therapy. I remember for a long time, I just said it was pastoral counseling. It was just that I met with Pastor Dane, blah, blah, blah. But all of a sudden, when someone gives you language, and it was someone giving me language, my office mate said when I described what I had gone through at Liberty, she said, "Oh, so you went through conversion therapy?" And I was like, maybe. And I had never thought about it in those terms when she, named that. And I was like, oh, that does map onto my experience. That is accurate. All of a sudden, when you have the ability to name something, your world opens up a little bit, right? That language is, a world creating, tool. And for me, it was a language and recognizing what happened in language allowed me, again, to come to terms, to find ways of describing myself, to articulate myself ultimately as a queer person. But I also think that academia, and the beautiful part of academia, is encountering difference. I mean, I grew up in Toronto, which is considered one of the most multicultural cities in the world. I went to a public high school, so I had a lot of friends with a lot of different beliefs, but I did not have conversations like I had in grad school, where these are, again, very concentrated spaces to talk about very particular things in a very particular space. And so having that luxury of sitting with other folks who were invested in these conversations and thinking through questions of race, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic status, right? All these different important parts of our day-to-day lives, it was a way of realizing, oh, you see the world this way, and I've never even considered that possibility. And I am rubbing up against this, really sharp difference in how you see the world. It forces you to reconsider and to at least reevaluate. You might come to the same conclusion, but bare minimum, you've thought about it. And for me, I was pushed to think about things I had never thought about, other than, through this very rigid theological, theoretical, approach to the world. So I think the grad school gave me the community, like a community of other like thinkers and learners, and also pushed me to see difference and to encounter difference in an open way and say, maybe my, heretofore understood sort of conclusions of the world that I said, like, definitively, this is the case, like Jesus is the answer for everything. Maybe Jesus isn't. And it was funny because it was in div school, right? So of all places where you perhaps expect you to reinforce your beliefs, for me, it challenged them to such an extent that I eventually walked away from religion. So I will say that the Holocaust and researching Holocaust was actually the straw that broke the camel's back. It wasn't actually my gender or sexuality, but it was all of these things in concert. Again, putting my theory second and my lived experience first, meeting folks who were different from me, and then again, really thinking in an intentional way about a lot of these different topics that ultimately gave me the tools or the keys to get the heck out.
Do you ever look at conversion practices through that lens with your academia hat of studying the Holocaust? Is that sort of an angle that you've looked at?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many parallels between the Holocaust and Nazi ideology and where North America is today. And to zoom out beyond just conversion practices, but I'll zoom back in just a second. I mean, even if you think about, what was the quote unquote problem in Nazi Germany? Jews. And what was the percentage of the population in Germany of Jewish folks? 1%. Today, there's 1% of the population in the US is trans. And these are, again, the folks who are being scapegoated. You can think about how during the Holocaust, if you were able to prove that you were able to change your sexuality, if you were an imprisoned queer person, you could get out, right? So this idea that sexuality is mutable, that it's changeable. These aren't new ideas, right? I think that if ever, your way of seeing the world aligns with Nazis, you should probably reconsider your way of seeing the world. And a lot of this, ideology that undergirds conversion therapy, right? Again, the belief that one can change one's sexuality, this is borrowed from a lot of these folks, a lot of these thinkers, right? And so if we can draw a line between Nazi understandings of sexuality and conversion therapists' understanding of sexuality, and they match up, again, maybe it's time to reevaluate. Now, do I think that the conversion therapists have the moral courage and the intellectual ability to make these connections and then therefore to say, oh, maybe I should give up these beliefs? No, I don't. I think a lot of these people are again, morally and intellectually bankrupt. However, for those who do have a heart in their chest and a brain in their head, I do think that this is a pretty convincing argument that if we can, again, say that Nazi understandings of sexuality map onto conversion practices today, at least onto conversion ideology today, then yeah, that's a pretty damning critique.
Do you ever think of the other folks who were with you during these conversion practices in that group? And do you wonder, if they're still battling this or if they, like you, have come to live their true and authentic lives?
Yeah. So the buddy I told you about, the one who would come to me to work with me, he eventually did get married to a woman. He had a few kids with her, and then I had written an article about, I don't know, maybe 2021 or 2022. It was an RVA magazine, and in that story, again, I describe our relationship and the role that he played in my life at the time. Well, one day, it was, a few years ago, I just get this message, and the name I gave him in the story was Gabriel. And so he says, all of a sudden, I just get this Facebook message, and it says, Gabriel, and he puts it in quotes, in other words, like him. And I always wondered, had he read the article? He says, Gabriel is no longer married. And I was like, what? And so, start messaging him and find out that, again, he had come to terms with his sexuality. He and his wife, ended things. And obviously it was a difficult situation, but, no real hard feelings, I don't think. But he was one who was sucked into that world. Another buddy who was in the story I referenced, it's the friend who introduces me to my crush on campus. He also got married. He also had kids. He's now out of that marriage and, living that big old gay lifestyle we were all warned about. But then the crush in the story, this guy, he's someone who I know where he's at today because my friend who I told you about first, when he was eventually again leaving that marriage, he was still friends with the guy who, again, the story is about. And that guy is still in that evangelical world. And he was really, really angry with my friend for divorcing his, the woman to whom he was married. And I think in large part, it's because that anger that he feels towards my friend is really anger that he feels towards himself, right? That he knows that he's imprisoned in this system and it's a prison of his own making. He does have the power to get out, but of course, a lot of things would change. A lot would crumble. His entire social network, which is within this high control evangelical space, would disappear, as it has for all of us. Like all of us who left these spaces, we don't have almost any contacts there anymore. Most people will immediately turn their back on you, and it's been the case for me. It's been my case for my friends, and so it would be the same for him, most likely. And so certainly there are a number of people who are still in this world. I will also say that just last week or the week before, I was on Instagram and all of a sudden I get this message, and it's a current student from Liberty who says they're putting me through conversion therapy. Like, I don't know what to do. So this is something that's still happening. This is something that's happening where it happened to me. It's not with the same conversion therapist. He retired, but I know there are other offices on that campus that continue to do that dirty work. And so, again, I have friends who have gotten themselves out, but I know a number of folks who are still in. And then the next generation and the next generation, it's probably just going to be the exact same. History doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly does rhyme.
Wow. To know that it's still going on today and certainly is not just a thing of the past. What do you think people should know about these conversion practices?
You know what? Some people ask, like, who's your ideal reader for the book? And I said, my ideal reader is very different from who's actually going to read the book. And the ideal reader would be conversion therapists. It would be people who are putting their kids through conversion therapy, people who are putting themselves through conversion therapy. This would be the ideal reader. I want them to read these stories, and I want them to read the introduction so that they know a few things. And the two things that I would really want them to know: you can be conservative religiously, right? You can have really conservative, i.e. homophobic and transphobic, beliefs, theologies, but you also can be someone who doesn't put, yourself or others through conversion therapy. Conversion therapy doesn't work. We don't have one confirmed case of it ever working, right? In all the years that it's been practiced, in the range of practices that have been practiced, not one person has changed their sexual orientation, their gender identity, and or their gender expression. Maybe their gender expression in the sense of that they perform a certain brand of masculinity or femininity. Yeah, you can affect a certain brand of, gender, but it doesn't mean that you yourself are changed. It's a performance. It's you're acting. But we have documentation, right? Evidence-based claims that conversion practices are not benign, but instead are wildly harmful. So not only does it not work, it has really, really, negative consequences. So even if you do have homophobic beliefs and transphobic beliefs and heterosexist beliefs, it doesn't mean that you should therefore be like, okay, let's either put myself or someone else through conversion therapy. Instead, it should, you again, I don't know what the next step for those folks is. Like, what do you do if in fact you think homosexuality is wrong or gender diversity is wrong? What do you do? I don't know. What I do know you shouldn't do is put someone or yourself through conversion therapy. There are going to be a lot of homophobes, a lot of transphobes out there. What they need to know is that, again, it not only does it not work, but it's also not benign, and it actually has a litany of psychological, emotional, spiritual, in some cases, physical consequences.
Is it hard to find any hope in this world, knowing that this stuff is still going on? Or are you seeing any sort of change within these faith communities, mental health communities, survivor networks? Is there anything that can give you hope?
You know what? I think that there have been numerous examples of why we should be hopeful, but I temper that with what I'll say afterwards. I mean, there are so many organizations, that have actively attempted to fight against conversion practices. So there are faith communities. I mean, a lot of mainline denominations, United Church of Canada, Reformed Judaism, a lot of different congregations who are within that tradition, certain Catholic groups, Dignity USA. There are so many different organizations, churches, and individuals that push against and combat conversion practices. In the other contexts, in secular or non-religious contexts, of course, there are numerous professional organizations, right? The American Psychiatric Association, American Medical Association, so many, really any professional organization that is respectable or a legitimate or credible organization fight against and speak against conversion practices. But what we've seen in the past few years is, if we saw the pendulum going in the right direction, there's been a lot of regression as of recent. When we think back to 2015 in the US, when gay marriage was legalized, a lot of these hate groups redirected their energies away from sexual minorities and really focused on gender minorities, and started looking at trans and non-binary and gender diverse folks. And that's where a lot of the concentration has been recently. And again, really the small percentage of the population has been scapegoated. And so seeing a lot of legislation, a lot of policy, seeing a lot of activism, anti-queer activism and anti-trans activism as of recent, not only offers you pause, but really causes a lot of anxiety, right? Especially for my gender minority friends and family. And so that is, of course, something to be deeply concerned about. I think on top of that, once they're done with the gender minorities, who are they coming after next? The sexual minorities are coming right back for us. And so I think that these are things that need to be addressed. And I think that it's the responsibility of faith communities to stand up and to step up. I think it's the responsibility of allies to stand up and step up, right? I think that we all need to be working together. When I hear, anti-Black racism, or when I hear misogynistic language, it's my responsibility too to speak up, right? I'm not a racialized minority. I'm not, I'm a cis man, but is it not my job to speak up and to, stand up to folks who do spew hatred? Absolutely. It's all of our job. It's all of our work. I think that what I take heart in is that I have a number of allies and I have a number of friends and family and community members who do stand up and who do, resist the hatred that, affects my community and other communities. And so I think there's a lot of good work being done. I think we just have to keep being loud, being vocal, and not allowing the other side to think that the battle's, done and over with. Because when I think that really, I'm thinking back to conversion therapy and thinking about, the recent Supreme Court case with, the conversion therapist was represented by the ADF, the Alliance Defending Freedom. And they, have made it seem as if conversion therapy, the ban has been overturned in Colorado, and that, all the other bans are going to be overturned soon too. They want us to think that the battle is over, because what happens when we think the battle's over, we stop fighting. But what we need to know is not only is the ban not overturned, there's only one conversion therapist in the state of Colorado that can practice conversion therapy, and that's the conversion therapist who brought forth the case. Otherwise, the ban is still in place. But if we aren't vocal, if we aren't active, then yes, that is a possibility. But right now, the case is still live. The merits are still live. So we need to continue fighting. We don't want the other side to again claim victory, because if they do, and we believe that, then we stop fighting. But we need to continue.
I love that. And part of being vocal is sharing your story and sharing the stories of these other survivors in your book. So I really want to thank you for putting that out there in the world and sharing it with us, and for being here on the podcast.
Well, thank you. This has been an absolute treat, and I'm super grateful to have met you and to chat with you, and for, again, platforming me and also other survivors. I appreciate it a lot.
And our thanks again to Dr. Lucas Wilson for sharing his story and for gathering all these voices together to give us a greater perspective of the harms of conversion practices.
It means so much to hear from someone who's really been through it in this way, and is so generous in the sharing of knowledge, information, and perspective. I hope that will be useful to others, including those who might be in a situation now where they're perhaps even going through conversion practices or something like that, and needing some help.
Yeah, that's right. We'll put a link to the book, Shame, Sex, Attraction, and also some links where you can find resources if you or a loved one is going through that, including Born Perfect, which is a national survivor-led campaign launched by the National Center for LGBTQ Rights, and also the Trevor Project.
I think one thing that we're learning here is that these practices are far from gone, and if anything, have a new life to them, partly because of the way that they're being used for gender identity conversion practices, as well as sexual orientation conversion practices. Equally harmful, but two different aspects of a discredited kind of practice. You know, we've talked today about some of the individual costs to this, but there are costs at a whole other kind of level, at the social and even macroeconomic level. And next time, we're going to tackle these same issues through a very different lens.
Yeah, we're actually going to talk to an economist, someone who you might not imagine hearing from on this topic, but you'll see why it's very relevant to this issue of conversion practices.
I can't wait. I hope you'll join us, and it is always a pleasure to have you, our listeners, with us on this journey. Unravelling is brought to you by Brattleboro Retreat. Our producers at Charts and Leisure are Andrew Atkin, Hans Buetow, and Jason Oberholzer.
And you can find us on social media by searching Brattleboro Retreat. Brattleboro Retreat is committed to exploring diverse perspectives on mental health. While we invite hosts and guests to share their insights, the views expressed are their own and do not necessarily reflect the policies or positions of the hospital or its staff.